What exactly, what precisely does it mean to any of us, to anyone, to run Venezuela? That is the $64 million question at the moment, the question on which America's standing in the world hinges on right now. That's after the Trump administration launched a raid capturing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and brought them to the United States to face criminal charges. Maduro and his wife were arraigned in New York City today on counts of drug trafficking and other crimes. He and his wife pleaded not guilty. He maintains that he is still the legitimate president of Venezuela. Meanwhile, back in Venezuela, the interim leader, Delcy Rodriguez, put out a statement offering to work with the U.S., but according to Donald Trump, she's not in charge. Quote, "We're in charge," end quote. That was Donald Trump who said that. Here's how he put it in his own words last night.
Don't ask me who's in charge, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
It means we're in charge.
We're in charge. We, the Trump administration, we, the United States of America, that's all we know from his lips. Problem is, it directly contradicts what one of the people Donald Trump, says he put in charge of running Venezuela, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Take a listen to that.
When the president was asked yesterday who will be running Venezuela, he said it was you. He said it was the defense secretary. He said it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Are you running Venezuela right now?
George, I've explained again that the leverage that we have here is the leverage of the quarantine. So that is a Department of War operation, conducting, in some cases, law enforcement functions with the Coast Guard on the seizure of these boats.
We'll coin the phrase hot potato. He said, not me. I'm not running it. The Department of War is running it. It was a law enforcement operation. That's DOJ, last time I checked. So it sounds like he's hoping to pressure Venezuela then into doing what Donald Trump wants Venezuela to do by blockading its oil and resources. He used the word coercion. But what Rubio seemed to be tap dancing toward and actually running the country, which Donald Trump says we are doing, are two things that aren't just shades of gray. They're on opposite ends of the spectrum. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling writes this today in the Bulwark, quote, "Regime change fails less often from a lack of resources than from a lack of both planning and responsibility. Over decades of command, I learned what I called the belly button rule for assigning responsibility. When a task is truly hard, complex, risky, politically sensitive, or strategically consequential, a senior leader in government, business, or on the battlefield must be able to point to one person and say, you are in charge. One person, one belly button. Every serious operation requires three things to be unmistakably clear: what must be done, by when or under what conditions, and who is in overall charge of making that happen. None of those three things are clear right now. Not who is in charge, not the timeline, not even the objective. And running Venezuela may, frankly, be an impossible thing for us to do. That's according to the guy who Donald Trump put in charge of his Venezuela policy last time. Here's a guy who had that job, his former envoy, Elliot Abrams.
The United States cannot run Venezuela. The worst thing that we could do, and we may be doing it actually, is to make some kind of deal with the regime's remnants, with the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, and leave her and the regime in place, except for maybe a change on oil policy. That's conceivable, but that's not our running Venezuela. That's the Maduro regime running Venezuela without Maduro.
Two very different things. As if on cue, Donald Trump on Sunday downplayed the whole matter and issue and urgency of free and fair elections while touting repeatedly the opportunities for oil companies in Venezuela. Watch.
Are you going to demand free and fair elections in the short term in Venezuela?
Well, it depends, what you're talking. We have to do one thing in Venezuela, bring it back. It's a dead country right now.
Have you spoken with the oil companies about going into Venezuela?
I have.
Which ones? Have you received any commitments?
All of them, basically.
Any commitments from the oil companies?
They want to go in so badly.
Short term, next 2 weeks, what do you need from Delcy Rodriguez? You've threatened Delcy.
Total access. We need total access. We need access to the oil and to other things in their country that allow us to rebuild their country.
Free and fair elections? Meh. Oil? Quote, all the companies want in so badly. We need access to all of it. Now, regardless of what comes next in Venezuela, Trump himself has moved on after revealing all of that. He's issued a litany of threats against more countries far and wide, asked whether there could be an operation against neighboring Colombia, whose president has been critical of Donald Trump. He said this, quote, it sounds good to me, end quote. As for Greenland, a territory governed by NATO ally Denmark, Donald Trump tells The Atlantic this, quote, we need Greenland, end quote. As for Cuba, Donald Trump says it is, quote, ready to fall. What the Trump administration has in store for the United States of America when it comes to Venezuela and the other countries he's named so far, we count at least 3 in the wake of a stunning military operation capturing Venezuela's leader, is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling's here. He served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. He's the author of that piece we read from. Also joining us, former United States Ambassador to Venezuela, James Story. He served in that role from 2018 to 2023. Lucky for us, he is now an MS Now International Affairs analyst. And with me at the table, to keep me honest, senior national security reporter David Rohde is here. He's been covering the story for us all weekend. David, let me do that. If you had a life that kept you away from cable news and you're not following the live blog online, tell us what happened.
On Friday night, the United States military, with a tremendous effort by the CIA, sent in aircraft, took out air defenses across Caracas, and special forces were able to snatch President Maduro and his wife. And it was this amazing operation in terms of the level of intelligence they had. They knew they built a replica of the house he was hiding in and practiced this thing. So there was definitely someone. The reward for Maduro was $50 million. But there was a source, and the Times reported this, that was saying where he was. So it was an amazing operation. I was woken up at, like many of us here, at 1:30 a.m. in the middle of the night. And when the president tweeted out that Maduro and his wife had been captured, it was just stunning. So hats off to the CIA, hats off to the military, an amazing success. And then since then is all the confusion you just summarized so eloquently.
Well, let's stay then when it was brilliant and perfect. What was the point? What was the reason? What was the purpose?
The purpose for the Trump administration was essentially that Maduro was not bowing to President Trump's demands and essentially saying, leave power. This amassing of all these, ships, all the strikes on the drug boats. Mm-hmm. And essentially, in the reporting is that Trump was particularly frustrated with Maduro's dancing, that he was sort of defying Trump so openly and not just relinquishing power. So from their sort of view of power politics, showing, I think, Maduro, but many other countries and leaders, that at least in this hemisphere, if you don't listen to Donald Trump, the U.S. could come snatch you.
Ambassador, take us through your analysis of what has happened since that moment. And if you disagree with anything David said, jump in on that, too.
David's on the money as always. I mean, the question is, you have a tactical success. What is the strategic play? What's the long-term play? And what's the objective? Is the objective regime change? Well, as Elliot Abrams pointed out, you have the same regime just under different management. It doesn't appear to be the restoration of democracy or a focus on human rights or stopping crimes against humanity or regional stability, but rather access to energy sources. And I think it's incumbent upon the administration to lay out what the plan is, because if we're in charge, it's interesting that just today they're getting ready to put out, I have a source in the country, their National Federal Registry is putting out a notice where they're looking for people who supported the U.S. government in finding Maduro. That would indicate that they very much are cracking down on dissent and looking for people who potentially helped us in this stunning success overnight, Friday into Saturday. That doesn't indicate that we're in charge.
Let me come back to you on this idea that the objective is unclear. Didn't Donald Trump tell us what the objective was? He talked to the oil companies ahead of the operation. He didn't brief Congress. And he said this, quote, all of them, the oil companies, want in so badly. We need access there to their oil for our oil companies. Isn't he screaming from the rooftops what the policy is about?
Well, he certainly laid it out during his post-operation plan. I guess my point is, well, what's the objective is to get access to oil. What is the plan to allow those international companies to go into Venezuela? You have the same regime. You have the same failure of having an independent judiciary. There's absolutely, I find it hard to believe, let me put it this way, that publicly traded companies with boards of directors are going to be willing to put billions, tens of billions of dollars at stake inside of Venezuela unless there is a clear strategy for restoring the institutions in the country and bringing the country into the democratic fold. I find it very difficult. There are billions upon billions of dollars in arbitration awards currently owed to all these companies. So if you're a ConocoPhillips and you're owed $11 billion, you have an arbitration award for $11 billion because of expropriation, is your board of directors going to say, okay, let's put another $20 billion into Venezuela? I don't know. I find it suspect.
There is, at minimum, major confusion, if not outright revulsion, at what the Trump administration has done in the name of the American people, without their input or consent through Congress or any other way. And there are questions now about the president's motives and plans across the board, even as many people look at the extraction effort and say, okay, the military did its job. They understood the assignment. They completed the objective. But what is the purpose of all this? Well, we begin with what's happening today, of course. This morning, Maduro and his wife were in federal court in the United States after that extraction that made so much controversial waves and attention across this weekend. Surely you watch the news, you've heard about it. So you're looking at the courtroom sketches that would be like any other case, except this is not like any other's case. We can tell you Maduro and his wife pled not guilty to a set of charges that have basically been developed over the years in the United States under multiple justice departments, and that includes narco-terror and drug trafficking. Maduro used his appearance in American court today, which is effectively the first time he's really had a platform to say anything after this unusual foreign policy attack and use of warlike United States power, to say, quote, I have been kidnapped since Saturday. I was captured at my home in Caracas. A helicopter transported Maduro and his wife from where they were being held in federal custody in a Brooklyn jail this morning.
Well, Ari, there's an element of fantasy to all this. I've spent a lot of time in Latin America since I was in my 20s. I know a great deal about Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela. It's an astonishing situation. We should take note, it was a remarkable military operation, audacious, complex, achieved surprise. They got 2 targets out of the country without getting them killed. At the end of the day, it wasn't just electronic warfare and coordination, 150 aircraft. It was Army Delta operators on the ground who the Cubans say killed 30 of their security agents who helped prop up the Maduro regime. Now, having said that, we have never seen in American history a president who would threaten Colombia, you're next, you'd better watch your ass, and I quote, a ground operation in Colombia would be something I'd consider. And in the context, he said this about Greenland, Panama, Mexico, annexing Canada. And throughout all this, the only important thing is under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has been supine, uninvolved. So we're being governed by whim and by decree. Mr. Trump doesn't have a clue what he's doing on page 2 in Venezuela. No good will come of this the way it's been conducted.
Ambassador.
Well, as always, General McCaffrey makes a ton of good points. It's good to see you again, sir. Last time was in Afghanistan 15 years ago. There was a tremendous amount of planning that went into the operation itself, a tremendous success, and it appears that the question "and then what" was failed to be answered. There are repercussions to these actions. And the idea that there's kind of the contours of a concept of a plan moving forward. They used earlier, Ari, the term regime change. This is the same regime with different leadership. There's no change here. I know Delcy Rodriguez, and we left behind, I know her well, she and her brother, and we left behind Diosdado Cabello, who's a very bad actor, frankly. And then you have Vladimir Prigozhin Lopez, who's been in charge of the military since the crustacean period, right? He's been there forever. So you've got a group of people there. You have these different power bases there. And if the idea is that somehow we're in charge, I would just merely suggest that, well, there are 900 political prisoners still in the country. There are wrongfully detained Americans still being detained. I don't see us being in charge. And if the idea, I don't know what the objective is. For me, the objective is restoration of democracy. There was an election last year that was won by Edmundo Gonzalez. It has been very destabilizing what Maduro has wrought to the region. But if the idea is that this is somehow going to become an economic play, I don't see, as you rightly pointed out earlier, boardrooms saying, yeah, we're going to put more money into Venezuela when it's the same exact regime in charge. No independent judiciary, no sanctity of contract. I wonder how we're going to reach the objective, if that's the objective.
Yeah, and Ambassador, I'll read from what you wrote. Without significant security forces on the ground, which again goes to what we've learned from past follies, it's hard to see how a failed state, riddled with illegal armed groups and foreign terror organizations, will somehow remain stable merely by removing a deeply unpopular dictator, Ambassador.
No, without a doubt. Right now, what we're going to be asking Delcy Rodriguez to do things that at some point are going to come up against the hard wall of reality of what Diosdado Cabello doesn't want to have happen. I'll give you a vignette. In 2018, a member of Congress visited Venezuela while I was there, met with Maduro, and someone I knew, a local councilman, Fernando Alban, was thrown off the 10th floor of the Helicoide, which is the torture center that was run by Diosdado Cabello. Clearly doing that to tell Maduro, don't negotiate with the gringos without me. This is the kind of person this is. So if you imagine at any point in time, Delcy Rodriguez gets out of line, he can play spoiler because he controls the security services in the country, as well as the criminal network and gangs that run and threaten and intimidate political opposition actors.
Yeah. General McCaffrey, this is one of those shockwave events that even though there was a buildup, both in the region, as the ambassador was discussing, and around the world in the United States, people are still coming out of this weekend going, whoa, I guess this is what we're doing now. And so it would seem that in the days ahead, it's going to be very important for Americans to learn and understand what's being done in their name and whether they want more of this or not. And we have an election this year. The Wall Street Journal, which is the print outlet sister of Fox News, says in returning to this form of, quote, gunboat diplomacy in Venezuela, Trump has spurned the usual veneer of armed interventions, acting without an Oval Office speech justifying the attack, congressional authorization, a promise of elections in a foreign land, or even, as you both noted tonight, a detailed plan for its future. And so, General, what happens in the days ahead? Okay, a congressional briefing here or there, but Trump is openly threatening multiple other countries. It would seem that there's a breaking point somewhere if we have warlike powers being exercised against multiple countries. Do we still have a constitutional limit here?
Well, by the way, something has to be said to add to the ambassador's terrific comments on Venezuela. The Trump administration action against that country, there's an element of goofy to it.
Well, for tonight's thought experiment, let's begin with consideration of the question of where would Nicolas Maduro be tonight if he was a drug trafficking, murdering, torturing dictator who hated Cuba and never supplied oil to Cuba. Marco Rubio wants you to believe that it's about this. It's all about this. Marco Rubio says that this 25-page indictment is the reason the United States of America invaded Venezuela and captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Most of the pages of the 25-page indictment do not attempt to describe crimes committed by Maduro or his wife. The indictment alleges that Maduro and his wife participated in a drug trafficking conspiracy. The only specifics offered about any criminal action involving Nicolas Maduro or his wife refer only to one meeting that his wife attended in 2007, 6 years before she married Maduro and long before Maduro became president of Venezuela. And according to the indictment, in that meeting, Maduro's future wife, quote, accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes to broker a meeting between a large-scale drug trafficker and the director of Venezuela's National Anti-Drug Office. That's it. No specifics about that. No indication of how they know that. And no meetings actually involving Nicolas Maduro are described in the indictment. This is as vague an indictment as you could imagine. But this is why Marco Rubio and Donald Trump launched their one-day war with Venezuela, according to Marco Rubio. The drug trafficking conspiracy described on page 9 of this indictment says the transshipment points in Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico similarly relied on a culture of corruption in which cocaine traffickers operating in those countries paid a portion of their own profits to politicians who protected them and aided them. And last month, Donald Trump pardoned one of the politicians described in that sentence on page 9 of this new indictment, the former president of Honduras. A politician referred to in this Trump Justice Department indictment was pardoned by Donald Trump last month, pardoned for drug trafficking scheme that is mentioned in the new indictment. Donald Trump already pardoned the Honduras guy. Donald Trump said this weekend that he pardoned the convicted drug trafficking president of Honduras because that former president of Honduras was prosecuted while Joe Biden was president of the United States. So any indictments of any drug traffickers during the Biden years are illegitimate, according to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's Justice Department rewrote that indictment, wrote a new indictment for Marco Rubio to stand behind, claiming that he did not wage war on Venezuela. He was simply using the military to enforce an arrest warrant for the Department of Justice. We'll have a more detailed discussion of the Maduro indictment later in this hour when Andrew Weissman joins us. Since Donald Trump's last consideration of a Latin American president accused of and convicted of drug trafficking was to pardon him, there is absolutely no reason to believe that the indictment is why the United States invaded Venezuela. What Marco Rubio did in Venezuela after spending most of the last year, we now know, secretly masterminding the invasion of Venezuela and the capture of Nicolas Maduro, was the closest Marco Rubio could come right now to delivering on the dream that will never die. It is the dream of some Cuban Americans like Marco Rubio and other right-wing extremists in the United States, the dream many of them have held since April of 1961, when a similarly planned invasion of Cuba failed at the Bay of Pigs. 87 days into John F. Kennedy's presidency, the CIA executed a long-planned invasion of Cuba, a plan that began before the Kennedy presidency. The invasion was at the Bay of Pigs, and it was defeated by Fidel Castro, who personally commanded the Cuban Defense Forces at the point of battle. It was a full humiliation for the CIA and the American military, and for President Kennedy, who considered it the worst mistake of his presidency, which it most certainly was. It was a stain on American foreign policy that Americans forgot, but the world did not, especially Latin America. This is the way it was supposed to go. The Bay of Pigs was supposed to go the way Marco Rubio and the team executed the plan in Venezuela. Donald Trump can be presumed to be lying about every reason he gives for everything he does, having been documented by the Washington Post for pathologically telling over 30,000 lies during his first term as president. Everyone who can think has known from the start that Donald Trump's missile attacks on small boats with outboard motors off the coast of Venezuela were not about stopping drug trafficking. None of those boats could have reached the United States. They are all too small and don't carry enough fuel and could only reach the closest island where they could have easily been intercepted. And now many observers feel vindicated in the belief that it was never about the drugs in those missile strikes because Donald Trump has now said it's about the oil. But what if he's lying again? What if it is not about the oil? What if it is about Marco Rubio's dream? What if it's about Cuba?
Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now, very badly failing nation. And we want to help the people of it's very similar in the sense that we want to help the people in Cuba, but we want to also help the people that were forced out of Cuba and living in this country. Do you want to say something about that, Marco, please?
Well, I mean, I just gave you a statement a few minutes ago about, when the president speaks, you should take him seriously. So suffice it to say, Cuba is a disaster. It's run by incompetent, senile men, and in some cases, not senile, but incompetent nonetheless. It has no economy. It's in total collapse. And by the way, they were, all of the guards that helped protect Maduro, this is well known, their whole spy agency, all that were full of Cubans. I mean, it's amazing. This poor island took over Venezuela in some cases. One of the biggest problems the Venezuelans have is they have to declare independence from Cuba that tried to basically colonize it from a security standpoint. So, yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned, at least a little bit.
A little bit. Marco Rubio doesn't really care about Venezuela. Marco Rubio cares that Venezuela has provided oil for Cuba. Marco Rubio wants to starve Cuba of oil and all other resources. That has been the failed purpose of the American embargo on Cuba for our entire lifetimes. Donald Trump may understand none of this, or he might understand a little bit of it. But it doesn't seem impossible for Marco Rubio to convince Donald Trump of the glorious place in history for him if he becomes the American president who finally liberates Cuba from dictatorship, finally fulfills the dream that will never die. If starving Cuba of resources does not work, we have now seen the dress rehearsal for an invasion of Cuba aimed at regime change. If that happens, when a reporter asks who will be running Cuba, there would be no disagreement between Donald Trump and Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio would proudly announce that he is running Cuba if he gets that chance. If Cuba is the real target, it serves Donald Trump's fog of confusion style to throw in threats to Colombia and Greenland and any other place he can think of while he's at it. There will never be a move of any kind against Greenland. Greenland is nothing but a Trump device for distraction, and it works. You will be able to find television discussions of, will they send troops to Greenland? Every second of that is nonsense, and every second of that is a successful Trumpian distraction from what they are really doing. President Kennedy was in the grip of very bad advice when he agreed to launch the Bay of Pigs invasion, an invasion that had been planned. The beginning of the planning occurred under President Eisenhower, the Republican president who preceded President Kennedy. American presidential politics has been in the grip of the Cuban-American dream of overthrowing dictatorship in Cuba ever since. And because Cuban Americans are concentrated in the important electoral college state of Florida, the United States of America has been politically, in effect, prevented through the mathematics of presidential politics from normalizing relations with the harmless little country 90 miles from Florida. Republicans in particular have spent the last 65 years lying about how threatening to the United States and the world the tiny country of Cuba is. And now Donald Trump and Marco Rubio have shown how easy it is to lie to a very supportive Republican Party and presumably Republican voters about what a threat to the national security of the United States Venezuela is. No one had ever heard that before, but they have succeeded on their side of our politics with that lie. Donald Trump believes the American military is his plaything, but the law and the Constitution says otherwise. The power to initiate war lies exclusively with Congress, and the power to initiate emergency military action for national defense rests with the president, but since 1973 requires the president to follow a formal notification process with Congress. That is the law. That law was violated by Marco Rubio willfully and Donald Trump willfully in their invasion of Venezuela. But today, Marco Rubio explained it all to our first guest tonight.
Quote, over 25 years in the U.S. Navy, 39 combat missions, and 4 missions to space, I risked my life for this country and to defend the Constitution, including the First Amendment rights of every American to speak out. I never expected that the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense would attack me for doing exactly that. Pete Hegseth wants to send the message to every single retired service member that if they say something he or Donald Trump doesn't like, they will come after them the same way. It is outrageous and it's wrong. There's nothing more American than that. Statement today from retired Navy Captain and United States Senator Mark Kelly after Trump Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced today that he is moving to demote Senator Kelly from his retirement rank in the Navy and also moving to cut his retirement pay. All because of Senator Kelly's true and uncontroversial legal public statements that U.S. service members can and indeed must refuse illegal orders. Joining us now live is Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona. Senator, I thank you so much for being with us tonight. I know this has been a heck of a day.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Let me ask, first of all, just your reaction to Secretary Hegseth's announcement today that he is moving ahead with trying to demote you and dock your pay for having advised military service members that they should obey their oath and refuse illegal orders.
Well, I'm surprised that they're continuing down this path and taking, these steps to try to silence me, silence other members of Congress, silence retired members of the military, former service members, really silence the American people. I mean, this isn't totally only about me. This is about all of us. And, I mean, this started back in November when we put out that video and Donald Trump said I should be hanged, I should be executed, prosecuted, and then Pete Hegseth ran with that and said he was going to court-martial me. And so today we're at the point where I guess they realized they wouldn't do well with a jury in a court-martial, so they're just going to go on their own and try to demote me after 25 years of service in the United States Navy. But here's the thing, Rachel. I'm never going to back down from these guys. I'm going to continue to speak out. I'm going to continue to do my job. And as much as I can, highlight how wrong these people are and how outrageous this is and how dangerous. So I'm not going away. This is just one step in this this process. And I think it's fair to say it's a big one.
I'm struck by the way this does and doesn't fit the pattern of other acts taken by the Trump administration in this past year. They have taken different types of acts of retribution against people who they see as their political opponents or their political rivals or their critics, running the gamut. Everybody from members of the board of the Fed to other elected officials to indictments of former Trump administration officials. And so it seems to fit that sort of pattern in one way. But with you, there's also the substance of the matter, which is why they're going after you by their own admission, which is advising service members that they do not need to, and indeed they must not disobey illegal orders. Do you think this is part of something they are trying to fundamentally change in the military in terms of the way the president uses the military, the way he orders them to act, and the kinds of expectations we have for ethical and lawful behavior by U.S. service members?
Well, could be partly that. I think the bigger thing here is Donald Trump didn't like what I said, and he was so struck by it, and in some ways, maybe I hurt his ego in a way that he now is starting to understand that members of the military don't have blind loyalty to him. he should know this. He's the commander in chief. He's been president before. The loyalty is to the Constitution, not to a person. And, you know, he didn't like that. And, you know, he did what he normally does, which is opens his mouth before he thinks, and then doubles down on it. And these are dangerous words, because if he can get me to shut up, I mean, I'm a U.S. senator. I was an astronaut. I spent, 4 trips in space. I flew 39 combat missions. If he's successful in getting me to not speak out against him or the government or Pete Hegseth or whoever and not do my job, I mean, what does that say to all these other retired and ex-service members? What rights do they have anymore? And this extends even beyond that. I think if they're successful in, and by the way, Rachel, they're not going to be successful in ever shutting me up. That doesn't, I mean, they could go as far as they possibly can go with that. That's not going to happen. But if they can, punish me in a significant way, that's going to silence other critics of the government. And that is a foundational problem for our constitutional democracy.
Senator, this is happening at a time when the military and the government are making, are doing incredibly controversial things, including this invasion, this action in Venezuela. You're on the Armed Services Committee, clearly. Do you have clarity as to why the administration did what it did in Venezuela this weekend? No, absolutely not. I mean, we don't yet. We'll have a brief this week. I'll be back in Washington tomorrow morning, and my expectation is we'll get a brief from Pete Hegseth, from Marco Rubio. We'll see what they're going to share. Usually when we get these briefs, we walk out of the secure facility with more questions than we walked in with. They often share what seems like a lot of nonsense with us, legal arguments that don't make any sense, half-truths. You pointed out today that it seems like the president may have been even lying about his conversations with oil executives. Is this about oil? I don't know if it's about oil. I mean, initially it was about fentanyl. Fentanyl coming from Venezuela, and then it turns out they found out, well, it's not fentanyl because fentanyl is not trafficked out of Venezuela. So then it was about cocaine, and then it was about regime change, and then it was about oil, and then it went back to a police action with regime change, and now it's back to, oh, we're going to run this country. By the way, the president says we're running the country. We're not running the country. There's nobody there to run the country. Maduro's handpicked successor is running the country. I worry about what happens next. What are the next steps that this president is going to take to, try to show that he is as tough as he wants everybody to believe he is? And when he realizes he's not running the country, and maybe the oil executives aren't as interested as he thought they may have been with oil at $60 a barrel, what does he do then? And how many service members wind up having their lives at risk because of, this president's ego and ambition? That's exactly right. Exactly right. Arizona Senator and retired Navy Captain Mark Kelly, thank you for putting your finger on it exactly. I know this is a crazy time for you. I appreciate you making time to be here with us tonight.
Thank you.